All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on something pretty fundamental. It's about how language actually acts. See, we're not just talking about words as like these static descriptions, but as dynamic tools that have the power to perform actions.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. When you say, I apologize,
Hmm.
you're not just describing a feeling. You're actually doing the act of apologizing.
Right, exactly. Or like a judge saying case dismissed. It's not just observing a state of affairs, but creating one.
Precisely. And for this deep dive, we're going to be exploring the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on speech acts,
Perfect.
a cornerstone for understanding this powerful aspect of language. And what's going to be particularly interesting, especially for those with a philosophical mindset, is this paradigm shift it represents.
Hmm.
Because you see, before speech act theory, the emphasis was primarily on truth conditions.
Hmm.
Is this statement true or false?
Right, right.
But what speech act theory shows us is that so much of what we say isn't really about being true or false at all.
Hmm.
It's about doing things with words.
Okay, so let's dig into the origins of this shift a bit.
Sure.
The SEP entry talks about the mid-20th century rise of the ordinary language movement.
Right.
And of course, J.L. Austin's work, especially his lectures, compiled in How to Do Things with Words.
Yes.
So what was the key insight, would you say, that really sparked this move away from seeing language in just purely descriptive terms?
Well, you see, back then, a lot of philosophers were grappling with how language that seemed so clear on the surface could lead to these really complex philosophical puzzles.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And thinkers like Bertrand Russell, they'd already pointed out how the way we structure sentences, the grammar, could sometimes hide the real logical form.
Okay.
So these ordinary language philosophers, they took this idea even further.
Yeah.
They started to suggest that some of the big philosophical problems we've been wrestling with for centuries, problems about meaning, knowledge, even reality itself, might not actually be about some inherent difficulty out there in the world. But maybe they stem from misunderstandings about how we use language on a daily basis.
Okay, interesting.
Their core idea was that if we look really closely at how we actually use words, in our ordinary conversations and interactions, we might be able to untangle some of these philosophical knots.
So instead of asking, what does this sentence mean in some abstract sense?
Exactly.
We shift our focus to what are people actually doing when they say this sentence in a specific context?
Yes, precisely. And Austin was a central figure in this.
Right.
He famously pointed out that, and I'm quoting here from the SEP entry, many utterances which look like statements are either not intended at all or only intended in part to record or impart straightforward information about the facts.
I like that.
So he urged us as philosophers to look beyond just the declarative form of sentences
Yeah.
and ask, what is the speaker actually trying to achieve by saying this? What are they doing?
Right.
Is it a warning, a promise, a command? The descriptive content might not be the main point.
So crucial, that distinction between simply uttering words and actually performing an action with those words.
Absolutely.
So then, how do we actually define a speech act? What sets it apart from any other act of speaking?
Well, this SIP entry offers a good starting point. It says many speech acts can be performed directly by just saying what you're doing.
Huh.
So you can resign from a job by saying, I resign.
Uh-huh.
You can make a promise with, I promise.
Yeah.
You can make a statement, an assertion by saying, I assert that.
Right.
Or ask a question by saying, I ask.
Yeah.
These are like the clearest examples where what you say is directly linked to the action you're performing.
Yeah, that's clear.
But, and this is important for us as philosophers, it's not the only way to do these things.
Of course.
And just because you say those words, those performative words,
Yeah,
it doesn't
that's-
automatically mean you've actually done the action.
Yeah, totally. Like, if I were to say, I promise to fly to the moon tomorrow, that's, well, clearly an act of speech. I said the words. But obviously, I lack the means and the context to make that a real promise.
Exactly.
It's just words.
It is. And this is where Grice's concept of speaker meaning comes in.
Yeah.
This idea helps refine our understanding of what makes a speech act.
Okay, yeah. That's speaker meaning, right? How does that fit into this?
So philosophically speaking, what's important about speaker meaning is the focus on the speaker's intentions. It goes beyond the literal conventional meaning of the words themselves and looks at what the speaker is actually trying to communicate.
Right.
Like that classic example, someone looks pointedly at their watch during a meeting. The literal action is checking the time, but what they might really mean is, hey, this meeting's dragging on, don't you think?
Yeah, we've all been there.
Exactly. So a speech act, Then you could say it's an act performed by a speaker who intends to create a certain effect on their audience,
Okay.
and they intend for the audience to recognize that intention.
So it's not just about intention, but about that intention being shared, understood.
Precisely. And this opens up the possibility of performing speech acts indirectly, or even without words at all.
Interesting. So to really have a speech act, we need the speaker's communicative intention and the expectation that this intention will be recognized by the audience.
Right.
Now, the SEP entry makes a distinction between speech acts and performative sentences. And, these terms sound very similar, but I feel like there's a subtle but important difference, at least for philosophers.
Absolutely there is. Performative sentence is actually a more specific linguistic category.
Okay.
Originally, it was used to describe sentences with very particular grammatical features. Like they're typically in the first person, present tense, indicative mood, active voice, where the verb itself describes the speech act being performed. For instance, I declare this meeting adjourned.
Okay, I see.
But the really important point is this. You can perform a speech act without using a performative sentence like that. And you can utter a performative sentence without actually performing the speech act.
Right, it's not a guarantee.
Not at all. The sleeping promise example in the entry is perfect. Someone's sleep talking, they mumble, I hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to.
Yeah.
The grammatical form might be performative, but the context means there's no actual act of bequeathing taking place.
Of course.
So speech act is the broader concept. It's any action performed using language.
Right.
Whereas a performative utterance is a specific case where you use a performative sentence, hopefully correctly, to carry out that act.
Okay, that makes it much clearer. Now, Austin also introduced this idea of illocutionary force. For a philosopher trying to grasp the essence of speech act theory, what does illocutionary force really mean?
Okay, think of it like this. Illocutionary force is the actual action you perform in saying something. It's a specific kind of speech act that the speaker's carrying out.
Okay.
Austin realized that just looking at the way a sentence is written or spoken often doesn't tell you the whole story about its communicative function. His example about bowing is a good illustration. A bow, well, it can mean so many things.
Yeah.
It could be expressing respect, it could be a sign of indigestion, or maybe someone's just looking for a dropped contact lens.
Or maybe they're really tired.
Exactly. And similarly, if I say, you will be on time tomorrow, well, that could be a prediction, it could be a command, it could even be a threat, depending on the context and what I, the speaker, intend it to mean.
So the same sentence can have all these different meanings, these different forces.
Exactly. So when we ask what's the force of those words, we're really trying to figure out what kind of act the speaker is performing when they say them.
The words themselves provide the content, the basic meaning, but the illocutionary force that tells us what the speaker's doing with that meaning, what they're trying to achieve.
Right, exactly.
Now, the entry mentions a challenge from Cohen, who questioned whether we even need this concept of illocutionary force.
Oh, right, yes.
If we already understand the meaning of a sentence, why bother with force? What was the basis of his argument, and why does the SEP entry ultimately defend the importance of force?
Okay, so Cohen's argument was essentially that if you take a performative sentence, like, let's say, I promise to return your book, the very meaning of those words, when spoken sincerely and in the right situation, well, that already guarantees a promise has been made.
Okay, yeah.
And if you use a non-performative sentence to make a promise, like, I will return your book, well, the promise is kind of implied by the meaning of the sentence in that context.
Okay, I see.
So Cohen suggested that illocutionary force might be redundant. Like, we've already got meaning. That covers the action part too, right?
I see, yeah. So why is the SEP entry pushing back on that?
Well, the entry rightly argues that neither the sentence itself nor simply saying it out loud is enough for a speech act to truly happen.
Right.
The sleeping promise example, again, shows us that. You can say a meaningful sentence in your sleep, but that doesn't automatically create a promise if you don't have the right intention and the right context.
That makes sense. It's more than just the words themselves.
It is, and that's what force captures, that dimension that goes beyond just the words themselves.
Okay, so to recap, knowing what the words mean is one thing.
Yeah.
But understanding the speaker's intended action behind those words, that's the force. That's another crucial layer of communication.
Absolutely.
This takes us to the really fundamental distinction between the propositional content of an utterance and its illocutionary force. Why is this distinction so important, especially for philosophers thinking about language?
Well, this distinction is crucial because it allows us to analyze communicative acts in a much more subtle and precise way.
Okay.
Think of content as the core idea being expressed, the literal meaning of the words.
Yeah.
So if I say you are standing on my foot, the content there is simply a description of where your foot is in relation to mine.
Right. A simple statement of fact.
But the force, on the other hand, that's my communicative intention behind those words.
Okay.
In that context, the force is probably a request for you to move your foot.
Yeah, get off my foot.
Exactly. The entry uses this great analogy from Stenius about chemical compounds, which I think is helpful for philosophers who like to think about things in a structured way.
Go on.
The proposition, the content, is like a radical in chemistry. It's a component, but by itself, it doesn't do anything specific.
Okay.
The illocutionary force is like a functional group. It attaches to that radical and gives the resulting utterance its specific communicative properties, its ability to do something.
I like that analogy.
So just like different functional groups can completely change what a molecule does, different illocutionary forces can change the communicative impact of the same basic propositional content.
Oh, that's great. So, like, the same basic idea. The door is shut. You can use that with the force of a question.
Right, is the door shut?
Or a command, shut the door. Or a statement of fact, the door is shut. Same content, but completely different communicative acts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as the Seppi entry points out, force can also underdetermine content. Meaning, if I just say, I promise,
Okay.
we know the force.
Yeah.
It's a commitment to do something in the future.
Right.
But we don't know what the actual content of that promise is.
Yeah.
I haven't said what I'm promising to do.
Hmm.
The force alone doesn't tell you everything.
Okay, that's a good point.
And this separation, this ability to separate content and force, allows us to study different types of speech acts in a more systematic way, regardless of the specific things they're about.
That's cool.
And modern linguistics has even taken this further. They've expanded the idea of content beyond just simple propositions.
Oh.
So now they include things like sets of propositions for questions, properties for imperatives. It really emphasizes how distinct force is.
Now, let's talk about this idea of how saying can make it so performativity. For a philosopher interested in the nature of reality and how we interact with it, this must be fascinating. How can just saying something actually change things in the world?
Right, it does seem a bit paradoxical.
It does.
But it all comes down to social conventions and the authority that we give to speakers in specific situations. So in certain situations, when someone has the right kind of authority and they follow established procedures, uttering certain words really can be the act itself, thereby changing the state of affairs.
Like a judge in a courtroom.
Exactly. When a judge declares you are guilty, or a priest says, I now pronounce you husband and wife, or a company director says, you are hereby appointed CEO, in these cases, the act of saying those words is the action itself.
Right.
But the entry stresses, this performative power, completely depends on having these underlying social rules and the speaker having a legitimate place within that system.
Okay, so what happens when those necessary conditions aren't met? That's where felicity conditions come in, right?
Yeah.
And the potential for things to go wrong, the misfires and abuses. Can you unpack that a bit?
Of course. Austin very carefully laid out these felicity conditions.
Right.
They're the background circumstances that need to be in place for a performative utterance to actually work, for the intended speech act to really happen.
Okay.
So misfires happen when these essential conditions are missing, and the act simply doesn't occur.
Can you give an example?
Sure. So imagine someone trying to name a ship the Noam Chomsky, but they have no authority to do so.
Yeah.
That's a misfire. The words are spoken, but no ship naming actually happens, at least not in any official or socially recognized sense.
Okay, yeah, it's just words again.
Exactly. Or think about trying to place a bet with someone, but they refuse to accept it.
Right.
Again, it's a misfire. You said the words, but no bet has really been established.
I see.
Then there are abuses.
Right.
This is when the act is technically performed, but it's done insincerely or without the speaker really meaning it. Like promising to help someone when you have no intention of actually doing it.
Yeah.
That's an abuse of promising. The act of promising happened, but it's empty. It lacks that crucial element of sincerity.
Interesting. The entry also talks about the fact that you can actually retract or take back some speech acts. Like you can withdraw a claim or be released from a promise. This is quite different from most physical actions, which are pretty much irreversible. What does this tell us about the nature of speech acts?
It's a good point. This ability to take back what we've said really emphasizes how many speech acts are based on social conventions and norms.
Okay.
Unlike, let's say, breaking a vase, which you can't undo, our commitments through language exist within a framework of shared understanding and agreement.
I see.
We can retract statements, we can apologize for things we've said, and sometimes we can even be let off the hook for promises we've made.
Yeah.
This shows that speech acts aren't just physical events. They operate within a system of rules and expectations that allow for changes and adjustments.
So they're dynamic in a way.
Precisely.
Now, there's been a lot of debate among philosophers about the nature of these performative utterances. Austin himself initially argued that they weren't really statements that could be true or false.
Yes.
So what are some of the main theories that philosophers have come up with about the status of performatives?
Well, this is an ongoing conversation in philosophy. Austin's initial intuition was that performatives were actions, not descriptions. So they didn't have truth values in the same way that statements about the world do. But then philosophers like Lemon came along and argued that performative utterances are actually true because they bring about the very action they describe.
Okay.
So I promise is true if and only if the speaker is genuinely making a promise.
Okay, interesting.
Reimer had a slightly different take. He suggested that performatives do have truth values, but they're not assertions in the same way that descriptive statements are. On the other hand, you have philosophers like Genet and Bach, who argued that performatives are a type of assertion after all, and they work because the audience recognizes the speaker's intention to perform the act.
Got it.
And Searle, his view actually evolved over time. He eventually came to classify performatives as a specific type of speech act called declarations.
Declarations.
And they have this special ability to bring about the state of affairs they describe, as long as, the right conditions are met.
Right, the felicity conditions.
Exactly. So you see, the debate really centers on how to understand this action-performing aspect of performatives in relation to their seemingly declarative form. It's a complex issue.
It really sounds like it. A real mix of semantics, pragmatics, and even the nature of truth itself.
It is.
Moving on, Austin proposed a way of classifying illocutionary acts into 5 broad categories. Can you briefly explain those categories and what were Searle's main criticisms of this classification system?
Okay, so Austin's 5 categories were
Yeah.
verdictives, which are about expressing judgments.
Like a jury's verdict.
Exactly, or doctor's diagnosis.
Okay.
Then there are exercitives. These are about exerting power or influence.
So giving orders or appointing someone to a position.
Right. Then there are commissives, which are acts that commit the speaker to some future action.
Like promising or vowing.
Yes. Then we have behabitives, which are about expressing attitudes and social behaviors.
Like apologizing or congratulating.
You got it. And lastly, expositives, which are acts that clarify arguments or express opinions.
Like stating a fact or defining a term.
Precisely.
Hmm.
But Searle had some pretty significant criticisms of this taxonomy, and they were important for how speech act theory developed.
Okay, what were they?
Firstly, he argued that Austin's categories seemed to be based more on just looking at a bunch of English verbs than on a really clear set of underlying principles. This led to some overlaps and inconsistencies. The same verb could sometimes fit into several different categories.
Right, that's messy.
It is. Secondly, Searle felt that the criteria for actually distinguishing between the categories were often vague and not well defined.
Okay.
Like the behabitives category, it just seemed like a grab bag of different actions without a strong unifying principle.
Right.
So Searle wanted a more systematic and theoretically grounded framework that really looked at the fundamental building blocks of illocutionary acts.
And that's where his idea of analyzing the aspects of illocutionary force comes in,
Exactly.
which he later refined with Van der Weyken into 7 key components. So for our philosophers listening, can you break down those 7 aspects?
Of course. So Searle and Van der Weyken proposed that any illocutionary force can be analyzed in terms of these 7 features.
Go for it.
First, you have the illocutionary point, which is the basic purpose of that type of speech act. Like, for assertions, the point is to represent reality. For directives, it's to get someone to do something. Then there's the degree of strength, which is how intensely the speaker is pursuing that illocutionary point. Like, suggesting something is a weaker form of trying to get someone to do something compared to insisting on it.
Right.
Then there's the mode of achievement, which is how that illocutionary point is achieved.
Yeah.
like asserting a belief based on evidence versus just stating an opinion.
Okay, so different ways of getting to the same point.
Exactly. Then you have content conditions. These are restrictions on what kind of content is appropriate for that type of speech act. So a promise has to be about a future action by the speaker. You can't promise something that's already happened.
Hmm.
Then there are preparatory conditions. These are the background conditions that have to be true for the speech act to be valid. Like, you have to have the authority to appoint someone to a position if you're going to perform the act of appointing them.
Right.
Then there are sincerity conditions. This is about the speaker's mental state, their psychological state.
Okay.
So, for an assertion, the sincerity condition is that the speaker genuinely believes what they're saying is true.
Yeah.
For a promise, the sincerity condition is that they actually intend to do what they're promising.
Right.
And finally, you have the degree of strength of the sincerity conditions. This is about how intense those psychological states are. Like, simply wishing for something is a weaker form of wanting something than strongly desiring it.
Right.
So by analyzing illocutionary forces through this framework, they hope to create a much more precise and systematic way of understanding and categorizing all the different things we can do with words.
This framework seems like a really powerful tool for philosophers who want to analyze language in detail. Now, the entry also talks about the difference between direct and indirect illocutionary force. What's the key difference there, and why are indirect speech acts so interesting for philosophers?
So direct speech acts are pretty straightforward.
Okay.
The form of the sentence directly matches the intended illocutionary force.
Give me an example.
Sure. If I say close the window and I mean it as a command and you understand it as a command, that's a direct speech act.
Right. Straightforward.
Exactly. But with indirect speech acts, things get a little more complex.
Okay.
You perform one illocutionary act by way of performing another.
Huh.
The classic example is, can you pass the salt?
Yeah.
Literally, that's a question about your ability to pass the salt.
Right.
But usually it's understood as a request.
Of course.
So I'm asking a question, but I'm really making a request.
Interesting.
And these indirect speech acts are really fascinating for philosophers because they show us the gap between the literal meaning of words and what the speaker actually intends to communicate.
Right.
The listener has to figure out the intended force based on the context, conversational norms, and shared knowledge.
That's like a puzzle.
In a way, it is.
Ah.
And the entry mentions that we often have these conventional ways of making indirect requests,
Right.
like things like, would you mind? Or it seems like.
Right. Right.
These are polite ways of getting our point across.
So understanding indirect speech acts requires us to think about pragmatics, about how we use language in specific situations to go beyond just the literal meanings of our words. And this brings up a question. Are indirect speech acts really their own?
Exactly. So it really highlights how complex the relationship is between speech act theory and the broader field of pragmatics.
Now, the entry also looks at how grammatical mood, things like indicative, imperative, and interrogative, relates to illocutionary force. And it seems like there's a connection, but it's not always so clear-cut.
You're right.
What are the implications of that for understanding how we communicate force?
Well, it shows that there's no one-to-one mapping between grammatical mood and illocutionary force.
Right.
So usually we use the imperative mood for commands, interrogative for questions, and indicative for statements.
Yeah.
But these aren't hard and fast rules.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about you will be late? That's an indicative sentence, but it'd be a warning.
Right.
And an interrogative sentence like, could you possibly close the door, is usually a polite way of making a request. So the grammatical mood gives you a clue, a hint about the intended force. But it's the context, their speaker's intentions, and that shared understanding between speaker and listener that really determine what speech act is being performed.
So there's a lot of flexibility built into language.
There is. This allows for nuance and politeness,
Yeah.
but it also raises questions about how much convention plays a role in establishing force.
And that brings us to force conventionalism, right? The idea that conventions are really important for determining the illocutionary force of what we say. What are the different versions of this view, and what are some of the philosophical challenges to it?
Okay, so force conventionalism, in its strongest form, suggests that for every type of speech act, there are specific conventions, rules that need to be followed for that act to work.
Beyond just knowing what the words mean.
Exactly. So for, I promise, there'd be a specific convention that connects those words, when said in the right context, to the act of making a promise.
Okay.
Searle had this analogy with marking an X on a ballot paper to vote.
Right.
That's a conventional act.
Yeah.
But then Strawson, he challenged this strong version of conventionalism.
How so?
He argued that lots of speech acts, like pleading with someone or expressing grief, don't seem to rely on these specific pre-established conventions.
Okay.
He thought that our ability to understand each other's intentions is more fundamental than following strict conventions.
So it's more about intention.
To a large extent, yes.
Mm-hmm.
While there are definitely conventions for certain formal speech acts, like legal pronouncements, the intentionalist view emphasizes that recognizing the speaker's intended force is really crucial.
The SEP entry then explores these intentionalist alternatives, where the focus is on our ability to recognize each other's communicative intentions.
Right.
But it also says that simply intending to do a speech act isn't always enough.
Yeah, good point.
Why is that?
Well, intention is definitely central, but simply having a private thought about performing a speech act isn't enough.
Yeah.
That intention has to be made clear to the audience. They have to be able to recognize it.
So it has to be public in some way.
Exactly. The entry uses this funny example of Sidney trying to propose marriage just by thinking really hard about it.
Okay.
Even if his partner could somehow read his mind and understand his intention, it wouldn't count as a real proposal.
Right.
Or imagine a dying person who silently wishes to leave their fortune to a friend.
Yeah.
That doesn't make it a legal act of bequeathing.
Okay. That makes sense.
These examples show that performing a speech act usually requires some outward expression, something that lets others see the speaker's commitment.
So the intention has to be kind of out there in the open.
Exactly. And that's the idea overtness.
Overtness.
The intention has to be intended to be recognized.
And that connects back to Grice's framework of speaker meaning, right? Where the speaker intends for the audience to recognize their intention to communicate something.
Yes, precisely.
So how does the idea of illocutionary force fit within Grice's broader theory of meaning?
So, within Grice's theory, the illocutionary force is a key part of what the speaker wants to communicate. It's not just what they mean, the actual content, but how they intend for that content to be understood.
Okay.
The force tells us what kind of communicative act the speaker's doing.
Right.
So when I make an assertion, I'm openly trying to convey a belief and inviting you to accept it as true. When I make a request, I'm openly trying to get you to do something.
Got it.
Grice focuses on this idea of reflexive intention, where the speaker wants the audience to know that they intend.